Welcome everyone to the Surrey Art Gallery here at Bear Creek Park in North Surrey. Both myself and the Surrey Art Gallery staff are immensely honored and privileged to be based on the traditional unceded territories of the Kwanlin, Semiahmoo, and Katzie peoples. The conversation that follows is convened on the occasion of the photographic exhibition, Rajesh Vora, Everyday Monuments. The exhibition consists of 150 photographs on loan from the artist, and we are thrilled to be the first institution to host the photographs of Rajesh Vora in Canada. Our distinguished speakers and tour guides today are Satwinder Bains, Director of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley, and Keith Wallace, Independent Curator and Writer, and the Curator of the exhibition. Following the tour, we hope that you are able to see the exhibition in person before it winds up on May 29th. Enjoy.
So Keith, this looks beautiful. Can you tell me a little bit about how Rajesh got to this point of creating this, apparently many more photographs than we see here, and also, how did it all get placed? Can you give me some background to all that?
Yeah, Rajesh started photographing these sculptures in 2014. Mm-hmm. We went together in 2019, so it's really been a 5-year project, and he went back, I believe, about 6 times and visited 150 villages. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to have a really strong impact as soon as you walked into the gallery. So, there's a lot of variety here, and it's, some people would think it's sort of salon style hanging, but we really wanted it to be like the images were dancing across the walls. Oh. And there's a kind of rhythm and a syncopation. Oh. And that was important for him. Rajesh really designed the whole installation. And he is an architectural photographer. Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of continuation of his professional practice, but taking his professional practice into a personal interest. So he wasn't commissioned to do any of this. It was his own kind of personal exploration of this kind of unique vernacular cultural expression that he was really fascinated by, as we both were. And we came to these sculptures at different times for different reasons, and then I was connected to him through a curator in New Delhi, and I contacted him, and that's how the idea for the exhibition really came together and started.
That's quite a long journey, but here we are. You have about 150 photos here, but you said it's a set of a much larger group of photographs.
I would say he's got an inventory of at least 500.
500
photographs, yeah. So it really shows the extensiveness of this sculptural presence within the villages. Mm.
Well, you can see the joy that came out of him taking the photography, and also see very much, as you said, the rhythm that he's created, and every set of photographs makes you pause and think, but it also gives you something you take away with you when you leave. So I think we're transformed by this. Nothing is going to change. We're going to be changed by what we see here today. So thank you for your curation. There's quite a variety here. Keith, can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here?
Yes, this particular cluster shows a real variety of the different kinds of sculptures and the stories they tell. For example, we've got an airplane here with Air France on it. That story would be, my family moved to France. They're letting the community know that they have gone to France. Here we have a boat, which relates to migration as well, in terms of pre-flying or pre-airplanes. And this relates to the Komagata Maru, which came into Vancouver in 1914, in which the migrants were not allowed to land. And it's a very important part. In fact, there were people from 90 villages that came on the Komagata Maru. Mm-hmm. So you see these boats in various villages. Also, early migrants traveled to Hong Kong mm-hmm. and Singapore on these kinds of boats. Here we've got a tank, and that would probably indicate that my father was in the army. And the Punjabis are very proud of their military service through many decades, through the First and Second World War, and many of the children go into the military. We have a weightlifter. It's like, my son is a weightlifter, and he's strong. And we have the Eiffel Tower. My family went to Paris. We have the Maruti car, which is the first automobile that was domestically designed and produced in India. So people probably bought this car, and they're letting the community know that we have a Maruti. So it's local stories and migrant stories. The airplanes would be migrant, the Maruti would be local. But it's really, they are like emblems of pride. And the idea of monuments in the exhibition title, Everyday Monuments, these are like monuments, but they're not like the ones you would normally find in a public square, which is commemorating a political figure or a war hero or something like that. It's family.
So they're very personal stories.
They're very personal
And they also
stories.
tend to, I suppose, talk about traditions of being in the army, or travel, or being farmers, or having this family tradition of travel to other countries. So I think there's stories around not just migration, but also about the here and now, but where they've been and where they're coming back to.
Yes, absolutely. And the exhibition as a whole has these different clusters, and we decided to make them into kind of thematics, or typologies. So we've got images of airplanes, a cluster of footballs.
Tell me a little bit about the footballs. That was an interesting one.
Well, the footballs, football is and we call it soccer here in Canada, but football is like a very, very important sport. And Jalandhar is a center for the production of footballs.
Oh, so they actually create the footballs.
They actually make them, they produce them there, yes. It's a center for producing footballs. And I don't know, are the footballs, do you know if they're made of leather?
Mostly made of leather.
Yeah, and so the Punjab's also very famous for its leather work. So that ties into it as well. And the footballs were some of the very earliest water tanks, and many of them were mass-produced. And there's also the early ones that are falcons, which are on top of the houses. And the idea of the falcon is that it's good luck if it lands on your house. And the other early ones are the army tanks. And in the clusters you see early examples and more recent examples. And then the airplanes started to happen. And the first one that I saw, the first sculpture I saw was an Air India airplane. And I was like, what is that? And I didn't know at the time, and it took me some years to kind of get the information to learn about it. So some of the other clusters deal with sports and the interest in sports, automobiles, the Maruti cars, weightlifters, Punjabi martyrs, who are very, revered in the history of the Punjab. And then there's lotus flowers, for example, which are a symbol of enlightenment. There's the boats that we see here. There's a cluster of boats. And then there's a cluster of things relating to farms. So you have tractors on top of houses, or a farmer with the bullocks and the plow. We've got a cluster with sort of like kitchen things, and there's a number of pressure cookers. We found a lot of pressure cookers. And I know that one of the stories behind the pressure cooker is that my son went to the UK and opened up a successful restaurant. So, the emblem of the family is like, my son is successful, and there's the pressure cooker. And everybody uses pressure cookers.
Well, they do now. At one time, they didn't use pressure cookers. And when I was growing up in India, when the pressure cooker came in, people were actually afraid of it because they didn't quite understand the idea of pressure, and that they couldn't lift the knob on top and it would explode.
Yeah.
So I think there's also, from your story, you're telling us about upward mobility. You're telling us about people who moved from villages to big cities in other countries, but came back to tell their story through their own professional maybe changes. And,
yes.
And they're also a little bit of bravado and a little bit of showing off about where they've been. So did you see that as well?
Yes, yeah. Oh, it's definitely, it is about showing off. And it's interesting because the early sculptures generally were water tanks. The more recent ones, people are moving away from them being water tanks, and they're placing, for example, the weightlifter here, he's placed on top of the water tank. I still feel it's all a part of the water tank, and I see the water tank as being a kind of plinth that you see in a gallery where you put the sculpture on top of the plinth.
So initially they beautified a functional thing, which was the tank, which held the water for the day to use in the village and the house. And then over time, on top of that, they created something.
Yes, and the sculptures over time became more elaborate and more complicated and really couldn't function as a water tank. And in some of them you actually have full-scale tractors or a full-scale motorcycle. And it's a very complicated piece of sculpture and it wouldn't function as a water tank.
So do you call it public art?
I would call it public art. The artists now, the artists for the ones that are not functional, and you talk about showing off, they call them showpieces.
Showpieces.
Showpieces, that's how they refer to them. But I do see them as a kind of public art, but they're not a public art that's where you see in big cities like in Vancouver or Surrey, where it's an expression that is not related to where it is necessarily, although a lot of artists are trying to contextualize their public art. But this is very genuine, unself-conscious in terms of being fine art. It's more about expressing, it's a cultural expression of a family and a village as well.
So Rajesh, who took these photographs, who is the photographer, you said he has had an assignment to go to Punjab and go to a gurdwara and look at how people were giving toy airplanes as kind of homage, or what were they doing with those toy airplanes?
Well, it was a kind of offering that they were giving in the gurdwara in the hopes of securing a visa to leave the country. And outside the gurdwara were all these stalls. And I went there as well, selling the toy airplanes. And so they leave an offering of the airplane and hoping to get their visa. And then the airplanes are actually distributed to children afterwards as toys. And so one of the most ubiquitous sculptures, in fact, are the airplanes, which do represent where people go. And we've got Air India. This is Pan Am, which is no longer in service. American Airlines. I don't know what this one is. And this also exemplifies some of the differences between the earlier and later airplanes. These ones are a bit more basic and crude in terms of their fabrication. And these are also fighter jets, these silver ones. So again, it's that relationship with the military and that pride in being the military. So these ones would not be so much about leaving the country, but the other ones generally are. And sometimes they have the name Dylan, and I think there's the name Gill, so they're identifying their family. And the later ones, as you can see, are more elaborate and larger, and really.
And can you speak a little bit to the architecture around where these are built, on top of the second floor of a building, of a house that the NRIs have built and then left, but come back to regularly? Because I see them quite well maintained.
Yes.
If they're not living there, how is this happening?
Well, very often there are family members still in the village who live in a portion of the house, and many of the houses are very large. But yes, many of the individuals who had these buildings constructed, they come back for a month or 2 months each year, and the rest of the time they're basically empty, or they do have caretakers as well. And, Rajesh was great because he would just knock on doors and say, can I go up and take a photograph of the sculpture on top? And everybody was so generous. We were never turned away. And we were always offered tea or biscuits or something like that.
For Rajesh, it must have been easier in a sense, because he just had to look up in the skyline and he could see what was out on top of the houses.
Yeah.
So as a photographer, he didn't have to search them out per se. But he must have been pleasantly surprised by the number of sculptures in the Doab region, and not just of airplanes, but of other things. What was his impression?
Well, I think it was a slow process at first for him to find them, but then eventually he just drove from village to village to village. And when we went, he was using Google Maps. And this is how we were negotiating ourselves to the villages, because some of them are very kind of deeply embedded within the landscape, and you just wouldn't come across them necessarily. But I mean, so when he was at the airplane Gurdwara, people had mentioned to him about airplanes of successful migrants who had left and come back and built these houses and the airplanes. And I think that another interesting thing about the architecture itself is many of the motifs are related to fulkari, which is a traditional embroidery practice that the Punjab is very famous for. And even like these flower shapes in the pediment there, I mean, you see that in a lot of fulkari embroidery.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next set. So Keith, a lot of things I see in this exhibit tend to focus more on the man and his tradition and his work and his desires. And even this exhibition, this part of the exhibit on the weightlifters, it tends to be very testosterone heavy and seems to focus more on the man. Did you find that to be quite true? And did you see these ones everywhere? Were they more than...
Oh, there's many of these. And yes, it is. I would say that the sculptures are very male-oriented. And, I don't know, it's a very patriarchal society, and the relationship between husbands and wives and women and men. And I mean, there's a few women represented, but they're often in a position of subservience, with, carrying something on their head, or whatever. But here it's like this expression of, the masculine male. And, this person here, for example, lives in Vancouver, owns this house and built this house, lives in Vancouver, but he was a championship weightlifter. So it is actually a kind of portrait of him. The other ones I don't know. It may be my son is, into weightlifting, or it may be a projection of strength and power. I mean, I really don't know those kinds of details.
Well, wrestling and weightlifting is a tradition in Punjab.
Yes.
It was a place for men to show their prowess, and they come from a martial race, so they want to show that they're ready for war or for protection. So I think it is a very performative art as well.
Right.
So as subjects, to put the male on top of your house in this manner, it really is telling a story about what we value, what the South Asian Punjabi population values, both when they leave and come back. That's what's most fascinating to me, that they're not even there anymore, but they're still continuing to invest in that idea of the superior race, a martial race.
And, and I think there's also a competitive aspect here. It's like, oh, you've got a weightlifter, well, I'm going to get a weightlifter, and it's going to have even more muscles. And you can see the muscles, like in this one here, are really exaggerated. There's a lot of these in the cluster, and one of the reasons for that, and the artist Rajesh Vora, the photographer, designed the whole exhibition ahead of time. I mean, I realized as a curator at one point that he has this way of seeing things. And he also sees the sculptures as taking a kind of portrait, even though they're outdoor, like a studio portrait, but they're outdoor studio portraits. So this is why he takes them up on the terrace level as opposed to from the ground level, because he just wants them to be like portraits. So, and it looks like they're all the same, but they're not. These are all individual commissions. And they're all different.
And they might reflect the owner that commissioned it as well.
They might reflect the owner.
So Keith, Punjab, of course, is the land of the 5 rivers. It's alluvial plain. There's agriculture is in our blood, in our veins. We have ancestral history. And these photographs certainly reflect and contribute to the idea that we are successful farmers. And we have actually taken that farming tradition and moved it to Canada as well. Some of the greatest farmers in BC or in California and in New Jersey, Michigan, you name all types of provinces of Punjabis. And of course, it's a very noble profession. But I also see that this is really placing the male at the head and the woman is in a more subsidiary role to her in service to him. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, in building upon the discussion earlier about the weightlifters, I mean, this really exemplifies it. And I think this image here with the male sitting in the tractor waving to people and likely the wife bringing lunch with the tiffin with the lunch, and I'm not sure what's on top of the head, but you see this in many of the images, and I've seen it even just individually. I've seen the woman's figure with that, and you also see it in Nek Chan's garden in Chandigarh.
Yes,
It's the same. It's like this classic pose of the woman carrying something on her head.
So I think that might change. You think down the road that might change?
I would hope so.
on that positive note.
Yeah.
So Keith, competitive sport seems to show up over and over again, and I think Punjabis are overrepresented in terms of going to sporting events and winning as well. And I love this work because it's showing that there's a winning streak, but it also is playful, and it's also having fun. And can you speak to this? What makes people put up a cup that they've won, probably at a soccer tournament somewhere?
Yeah, I think this is representing winning the World Cup and that kind of sense of pride and that idea that things can be playful in terms of sports, etc., and that not all the images are necessarily some diasporic story, but this could be my son is part of a football team, and the owner of this house lives in the UK, and he sponsors sports events in the UK. So this is the tug of war, and I think the tug of war is also kind of a popular sport, like kabaddi and football and tug of war, etc., and wrestling. They're all very popular.
I also think there's a philanthropic idea from Punjabis when they go back. They don't just beautify their homes. As you said, they go back and they give back to their communities. And I've heard that they hold tournaments and try to get young people involved in sports so they wouldn't get into trouble, and educating them both in the school as well as in the sporting field. So I see that philanthropy is also showing up in these works.
Yeah, actually, I mean, it shows up in several ways. There's employment deficit in many of the villages, and young people don't have a lot of opportunities. So building these quite extravagant houses actually creates jobs. And the sculptures has created a new form of art expression. And and as you were talking earlier about showing off, yes, they are a kind of show off, but they're also giving back. And they give back in more ways than building the houses. They give back, there's a panel in the resource room in the side gallery talking about giving back. They build hospitals. They build a meeting building for war veterans. They build a ladies' gym.
Yes.
They build bus shelters. They build memorials, marketplaces, sanitation systems, education. So there's a lot of giving back over time. And I think when people look at these, and it was important to have that component in the exhibition so that it doesn't just look like it's a big show off, but there is an investment back in the village.
Yeah, that's a really important piece. Thank you for sharing that, Keith. So Keith, it wouldn't be complete without talking about who creates these sculptures. Tell us, you went and met them, you heard their stories. Tell us a little more about them.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think one of the questions that's come up in the exhibition is like, who makes these?
Yes.
And there are probably 25 to 30 artists who make these sculptures.
And are they in the region? They live close by?
They serve a kind of 60-mile radius or kilometer radius around their studios. So there's sort of clusters of artists and clusters of sculptures that represent certain artists.
And you call them artists?
I call them artists, yes. And I asked them if they think of themselves as being artists, and the answer was, well, people call us artists. So I guess so. They didn't go to art school, though. It's an apprenticeship process where they learn from an elder or a senior sculptor, and it gets passed down. So that's a very kind of craft tradition,
Yeah.
but I still see them as art. And in fact, this artist here, he's got Art is Life on the sign of his studio where he has his sculptures on display, the ones that he specializes in, although he does a lot of motorcycle images. And
there's a tank being created.
A tank, yes. And the process really is that they start out with a rebar structure, cover it with mesh, then it's covered over again with cement, and then it gets painted.
And tell me about their relationship with the NRIs who are finding them and sourcing them and giving them work.
Well, often the contractors, when an NRI says, I want to build a house, often the contractor will say, well, would you like a sculpture on top of your house? And then they will identify what kind of sculpture that they want, and they or their family will speak with the sculptor, but the sculptor often has pretty free rein in terms of what they make. And this sculptor here, Darvinder, who's in the village of Banga, we went to visit him, and we visited in October 2019, and it's like, we mentioned Surrey, and he said, oh, Surrey, I was there for 2 months in April.
And he was visiting, or he was
he was brought to Surrey because he's a traditional Punjabi singer of traditional songs. And he did performances. And he actually did a performance for Rajesh and I as well, which is very sweet. But he's also a sculptor.
And this is their livelihood.
It's his livelihood.
And it gives them enough money to continue with this work?
Yeah. This person here, Sun Call, he's got quite a nice house. In fact, this is one of his studios, and the house is right in behind. And, if they're very large sculptures, sometimes they will go up in 2 pieces and be finished on top of the house. Otherwise, it's just like pulleys and ropes that take them up to the top of the house.
Do they sign all their sculptures?
No. But they know, they can recognize each other's work. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. So, Keith, first of all, congratulations on this beautiful exhibit that you've created. For me, you brought a bit of home. For me, I have 2 homes, but you brought a bit of my first home into Surrey, and I thank you for that. And I'm interested in, how you name the exhibit Everyday Monuments. I understand that they're everyday monuments, but they speak volumes about whole lifetimes. What did the families think when they started doing this work? Was it 30 years ago, 40 years ago, perhaps, when all this started?
Well, I don't know exactly when it started because it's very difficult. There's 3,500 villages in this one district alone, so you're not going to get the consistent story. But from talking to people and talking with the fabricators, I would say it started in the 1980s, started to build up, but really in the 1990s is when it started to take off, and the early 2000s is when it started to take on more variety.
Well, it makes sense because the waves of migration out of Punjab after independence, after the 1947 independence, shows that people moved out in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And I look back at the gaze of coming back and then reinvesting in your home. It took 30 years probably of settlement and adaptation and creating some wealth to go back to their homes and have this beautiful pieces that they put on top of their roofs for everyone to enjoy.
Yeah, and when you see the houses inside, which are quite elaborate, it makes you think that these people are actually very wealthy. In many cases, they're not really that wealthy, and they spent 1 or 2 decades working very hard, saving their money to take it back to the village where their families are, and the families go back generations. Mm-hmm. And that I just think it's so beautiful, kind of the connection that people have maintained with their villages and how they're expressing it.
And the landscape has changed.
Yes.
You know, when you look up in the sky,
Yes.
you see a whole new landscape. And I
Yes.
think it's quite beautiful. It's quite interesting. It keeps you engaged, driving from one village to the other,
Yes.
seeing the similarities, but also seeing the differences. And I think you've brought to us this beautiful imagery through Rajesh Vora's work.
Yeah.
And we congratulate you on this beautiful exhibition in the city of Surrey.
Well, thank you. And I would just say that this is the first time these images have been seen outside of India. So, I mean, I think that's kudos for Surrey for doing this. I think it's kind of groundbreaking in a way. And it's very important for me because being non-Punjabi, I think it's important for non-Punjabis to kind of see this aspect of Punjabi culture, which is so rich.
And something maybe they haven't thought about or seen before.
They never knew. And people who've come into the gallery said, like, I had no idea.
So,
Even though the Punjabi community has been here for over a century.
well, I thank you. It brings a lot of pride and joy to me and to others that you've traveled this far distance and brought a little bit of home back into Surrey. And I think Surrey and Punjab are totally interconnected. Thank you,
Yes,
Keith.
thank you.